Quantum Castaways by DustTraveller. Chapter 7. Reaction. "I think we're clear, Marshall," Twilight said finally. Marshall was silent as he scrutinized the jungle. There was an awful lot of it to scrutinize. It had been an hour since either of them had spotted the thing out in the jungle. Things were quiet, for the moment. At the risk of sounding cliché, perhaps a little too quiet. "Marshall?" He took a deep breath, let it out, then frowned. "We can't afford to be premature. Neither of us is in any shape for another sprint like that." He spit and shook his head. "Damn, if only I had my binoculars," he muttered. Twilight's ears drooped, which aggravated her wounded ear, but she merely grimaced at the sting. Marshall noticed her gloomy look and patted her back reassuringly. "Ah, Sparks, I didn't mean nothing by it. In emergencies, you have to prioritize. It was a no-brainer." She grinned weakly. "So I rate higher than a pair of binoculars, huh?" Marshall grinned. "Oh, definitely. Now, if I was carrying a large pizza and some beer?" She refused to be nettled by this, since this sort of thing was very Marshall. "Yeah, I get you. Hay fries, a half-dozen of Pinky's cupcakes, a white chocolate latte from Starbucks, ice cream." She groaned. "Oh, ice cream." Marshall sighed mournfully. "Okay, now that we have officially progressed into the food porn stage of subject digression, should we go for it?" She looked dubious, but nodded reluctantly after a moment's consideration. "I don't see much alternative. We have no food, limited water, and no shelter. Night's coming fast. If we don't move now, it's going to be pitch black before we even get halfway." He nodded grimly and came to a standing position. Twilight groaned, but followed. It was going to be a long trip. Slipping out proved to be easier said than done, however. The circle of adult root scrapers had tightened into a paranoid, overprotective ring of flesh that even Twilight couldn't slip through. After several minutes, Marshall spotted an opening towards the woods in the right direction and made a break for it, only to be shoved back by a head the size of a genetically enhanced watermelon on a long, thin cable of a neck. While compared to the body the head was tiny, it was by no means insubstantial, and it was still on an effective whipcord of muscle. He was pathetically easy to bowl over back into the circle. The root scraper cow made burbling warning noises at him. Twilight smirked quietly at his offended expression, and he scowled. "Okay, this is fucking retarded. What's the deal?" She looked at the circle thoughtfully and nodded to herself. "They're protecting us. They think we're kids, remember? They're still shook up about that thing's attack." Marshall tried again, and was again rebuffed, a bit more forcefully this time. He fell backwards hard onto his ass and continued backwards, the force sufficient enough that he actually rolled a little ways. Twilight chuckled a little. He obviously didn't think the situation was very funny, but then it wasn't happening to her. She knew well enough not to get into a disagreement with a 10-ton animal. He rubbed his aching buttocks. "Laugh it up, horse-face. Got any bright ideas on how to make 'em let us go? 'Cause I really don't want to be here when they decide it's feeding time." She gave him a squinty sort of look, then considered. She shook her head. "Nope. Also, I wouldn't worry so much about that, Marshall. It's silly. Well, what we have is a distress whistle, not a feed-me whistle. That would sound more like, oh. A sound like 3 horrifically clogged sinks backing up simultaneously sounded overhead, and Marshall had a split second to watch Twilight's pupils go to pinpricks before a literal torrent of puke green-colored, half-digested palm heart chunks rained down in a deluge on the hapless unicorn's head. The downpour turned her mane into a slime-slicked purple-greenish mass that hung limply down her face, covering her eyes and neck, and dripped sluggishly from her back and sides. She blew a bit of the sodden hair out of her eyes and gave him a stunned, "What the fuck just happened?" look. For his part, Marshall reacted with his usual grace and poise. He was rocked on his heels in the throes of terminal hilarity, laughing so hard he actually involuntarily sat down hard on his rump next to her and pointed helplessly. Great whooping gales of laughter startled out of him. Tears streamed from his eyes. Oh, man, that was classic. I wish I could take credit for that one. Well, that was all you, Mare Friend. She blinked and then spoke in a small, shocked voice. I don't know which is worse, that my mouth was open or that it actually doesn't taste all that bad. He giggled at this, then ran a finger through the mess on her mane and gave her a considering lick. She gave him a terminally disgusted look. He frowned, then scratched his chin. Hey, you're right. Kinda tastes like poi. She gave him a confused look, cocking her head slightly at this, and as she did so, she failed to notice the gathering group of baby root scrapers pushing in closer. She noticed in a hurry when one of them gave her a long, slow lick up her right side. What is... Hey, what the... So stop! That tickles! Marshall, make them stop! Marshall just continued pointing and laughing at her misfortune as the root scrapers gathered around her like a horde of ravenous zombies going in for the kill. She rolled around in giggling panic under their merciless ministrations, kicking her legs uselessly in a convulsing paroxysm of involuntary mirth. Stop! Stop! Stop it! Stop! I'll pee! It was a testament to the pandemonium of the moment that it was unclear which of them actually said it. It may have been both. At some point during all of this, the adults tightened into a defensive position again. They had noticed a pair of luminescent yellow eyes watching hungrily from the jungle's edge. Come on, Twilight. You have to admit, it was pretty fucking funny. Twilight Sparkle gave him a flat look and shook her head slowly from side to side, staring at him the whole time. Marshall, I was just given a full-body involuntary tongue bath by a horde of infant reptiles. That was just sick. No, it was wrong. It was wrong sick. It needs a whole new word. Oh, come on, Sparks. Mare up. I know guys back home that would pay good money for something, well, similar to that. I mourn for your species' lost innocence, Marshall. That was all of the molest. All of it! He giggled. Actually giggled at this. Well, it was for the best anyway. I mean, on the one hand, they got all that crap off of you, and on the other, that thing came back. We would have been screwed. So in a way, your humiliation served a valuable function. Way to take one for the team, Sparks. She raised her hoof towards him. He raised a quizzical eyebrow. What's that supposed to mean? She blew frustrated air through her nostrils. I don't have fingers. This is a pony giving you the finger. He chuckled. It loses something in the translation, Sparkle. Yeah, well, your face is lost in translation. He shook his head. What? She sighed and looked out towards the jungle. It sounded better in my head, she muttered petulantly. Marshall followed her gaze, rolled his eyes, then sighed. Well, I'll give that fucking thing this, Sparkinator. It's damn persistent, Marshall said dryly, a hint of annoyance in his voice. The two of them had recovered enough to sit up and were now watching the adult root scrapers ward away the whatever it was for the fourth time. It was smart enough not to wade into that much whoop-ass directly, but it was also just a tad too big and beefy for the root scrapers to attempt to simply stamp and slash the life out of it. What occurred then was a slow, meandering circle of threat displays and hissing around the outskirts of the clearing. The outlier root scraper cows had been chasing it for the past several minutes. They'd get close, the two parties would bellow at one another for a few minutes, then someone would get a smack or thrust in and the thing would start backing off again. Rinse, repeat. I'd be a little more admirable of its virtuous qualities if it wasn't employing them in support of the quest of eating me, Marshall. Twilight had had about enough. Sure, that thing was terrifying. One only had to look at it to see that it was an absolute apex predator. Terror is never permanent, though, and after all they'd been through, it simply wasn't sustainable. The body can only maintain perfect alertness for so long. Eventually it runs out of oomph, and when that happens, it happens fast. Oh, come on, Sparks. Can you blame it? I mean, look at this flank. Marshall patted the rump in question. Hey, she sputtered indignantly. This is grade A choice magical pony flank steak. I mean, I know I said I wouldn't eat you or anything, but come on. That's not funny, Marshall. She gritted her teeth. His voice became sing-song like he was quoting a jingle or something. I want my pony, flame pony, flame pony. Hey, ow! You bit me! Serves you right, beefcake, she said, a slight smirk drifting across her face. Marshall chuckled at this and rubbed the bruise on his forearm. Okay, Sparks, you win. Just trying to take your mind off of it. She frowned at this, realized that to a certain extent he'd succeeded, and dropped her ears in chagrin. This tugged on her bloody ear again, and she hissed at the sudden, unexpected reminder of her injury. Pony feathers, that's smarts! Marshall caught this and winced in sympathy. Does it still hurt, Twy? She sighed. Marshall, I don't know what's in those immobile seashells you have the audacity to call ears, but there are a lot of nerves in pony ears, so yes, it does hurt, quite a bit, actually. Marshall gave her a mournful look and sighed. Shit, Twy. I am so sorry about that. Damn. 6 inches to the side, and she put a hoof on his arm and gave him a soulful look. Marshall, when that thing charged me, you stood your ground and tried your best to give it something else to worry about. It was dumb. Absolutely moronic, actually, but it was a very brave, noble sort of stupid. Marshall quirked her a smile. Well, we can't all be geniuses. Genii? What's the right plural word for... She snorted and shook her head. Both, actually. There's some controversy over which is proper, but since the etymology of the word means a guiding spirit, he clutched his chest. Stop! Too much intelligence. Incompatible with stupid human. You're killing me. It was goofy, but he was trying, and she giggled in spite of herself. He smiled back and frowned, then his expression cleared, and he twisted to snap something off of his belt. At the awkward motion he winced, and she realized that he'd actually taken quite a beating of his own. Her eyes flew wonderingly over the dented magazines on the right side of his harness. It looked as though someone had struck him across the chest with an ivy, which she assumed wasn't too far off from what actually happened, if it happened to be an I-beam wielded by an adult dragon. How he didn't have broken ribs, she didn't know. I totally forgot. I have my emergency kit on my belt. Come here, Sparks. Let's clean that up before it gets infected. She frowned, then shrugged it off and wiggled over to him, leaning the side of her head with the wounded ear towards him. He opened the kit and cleaned his hands with one of the sterile wipes before turning to her. He looked at her for a moment, obviously planning the best way to do this, then shook his head. Come on, Sparks, put your head in my lap. She gave him a dubious look. Hey, don't give me that look. It's your flank I'm interested in, not your... Ow! What's with all the biting? I don't want to use any magic after draining myself that badly. And besides, there's no point in ringing a dinner bell for that thing. Think of it as negative reinforcement. Aside from my horn, my mouth is one of my primary manipulators. Joke about it and I bite again. Hard. He rolled his eyes. All right, all right. All joking aside, Twilight Sparkle, trust me, this will be a lot easier if you lay your uninjured ear down on my lap and let me do this. I have some experience with this sort of thing, okay? How would you have experience with cleaning pony ears? He rolled his eyes. I used to own a German Shepherd, okay? A really big dog. Poor guy used to get ear infections all the time, so I used to clean his ears for him about once a week, and that kept the infections to a minimum. Damnedest thing, too. Only dog I've ever known who liked having his ears deep cleaned like that. Just lie there and groan while you did it. I love that dog. Used to make my ex-girlfriend sick when I did it, but towards the end she annoyed the piss out of me, so I used to do it when I wanted to make her leave the room, usually right after she ate. Man, that takes me back. I called it Umox after Star Trek. Marshall, as fascinating as that trip down memory lane is, I'm not sure whether I should be insulted that you're comparing me to a dog, or impressed at your passive-aggressive attempts to antagonize a girl into leaving you, rather than just being mature about it and parting ways amicably. She annoyed the crap out of me, but she fucked like a demon, so... Okay, too much information, monkey boy. With that, she stood, maneuvered herself to his other side, and dropped her head into his lap. She ended up with her good ear pressed against his thigh and her wounded ear facing upward. From this vantage point, staring out across his legs to the circle of root scrapers, she could see the root scraper younglings scrambling over one another and playing. Let's get this over with, Marshall, she muttered, staring off into the distance. Twilight, if you're uncomfortable... Marshall, I trust you, okay? I do. Just be careful. Ears are very sensitive. He let out a deep sigh, angled himself slightly, and brushed her mane a bit absently. He gently laid his hand on her neck, and her ear flicked involuntarily. She winced. "Easy, easy," he muttered, and she heard the slosh of disinfectant. She shifted slightly. "This is gonna sting, Twy." She sighed. "I know. I'll try to keep still." He gently began to clean the wound, carefully, slowly. Even still, she winced at times and hissed at others. "How bad is it?" she asked through gritted teeth. "Well, it could be worse, but..." He hesitated. "What?" she asked, suddenly worried. "You're missing a chunk, Twy." When she stiffened at this, he was very quick to clarify. "It's not a big piece. Chunk is a bad word. Maybe notch is a better word. I'm sorry, but this isn't going to heal completely clean, even with stitches. In fact, stitches probably wouldn't even help in the least." She sighed. So the island had succeeded in marking her permanently, just as it had marked Marshall. She hoped it didn't look too bad, but she didn't want Marshall to feel worse than he already did about it, so she decided to play it cool. "I thought it felt weird somehow. Still, it could be worse, I suppose." "Like I said, Twy, you're lucky it wasn't about 6 inches over. I could have killed you, Twilight." The way he said it, matter-of-factly, monotone, it didn't sound good. It worried her, actually. He was taking this much too hard. "I already said I don't blame you, Marshall. It was an accident." She could almost feel his frown, but instead of responding, he turned to the kit and removed a bandage. A quick, deft move with his fingers, and the adhesive bandage was in place, snugly wrapped around her wound. It actually helped with the pain quite a bit, now that every flick of her ear didn't rub the raw edges together. Before she could gather herself up, Marshall gave her neck a light touch, and she paused. "Since you're already like this, you've got a bloody mess all up in the canal of your ear, Twy. Should probably get that cleaned out." She sighed. "Okay, just be careful." He went to work carefully, and it was the damnedest thing. He obviously had done this before in a similar setup, with a similarly sized ear, and those fingers combined with the little cotton swab stick thingies. Her eyes rolled involuntarily, and she slumped bonelessly on his lap as he worked the dirt and dried blood out of the crevices of her ear. She groaned. She couldn't help it. The last time she'd had a deep ear cleaning like this was one trip with Rarity to a day spa, and that simply couldn't compare to this. Not by a long shot. He chuckled. "Damn, and I thought Max was a hedonist. You are enjoying Umox entirely too much, Sparks." She muttered something incoherent into his leg, and he chuckled again. "What was that?" he asked. "Less talking, more cleaning, monkey," she said drowsily. "Jawohl, mein Marshal. If you keep spouting Germain at me like that, I'm going to bite you again. And I should point out that all I have to do is turn my head." She felt him wince. "Ouch. Okay, sorry." After a while, he stopped cleaning, but she didn't bother to lift her head. Instead, he just started petting her mane, and she let herself kind of drift. It was nice, especially after the stress and terror of earlier that day, followed by the admittedly hilarious, but not entirely restful, assault by baby lizards. Perhaps they should have been more attentive to the situation, but it just felt so nice. "We both almost died, you know," she said, half unaware that she was speaking. He continued petting her quietly. "Out there, earlier, there were at least a dozen times where we were both almost killed. If you hadn't picked me up..." He felt her take a deep breath and let it out. "Yeah, well, if you hadn't kept that thing off of me while I was unconscious." She shook her head slightly. "I don't think so, Marshall. I think the only reason you were injured at all was because you were between me and it." She frowned. "That thing definitely had a hard-on for you," he mused. She wrinkled her muzzle at that word choice and sighed. "I could feel it, Marshall. I've never felt something like that before." He made an encouraging noise, and she considered. "It was like being next to a fire, only it's some bizarre kind of reverse fire, sucking heat in instead of putting it out." She shuddered. "Throwing magic at it, all of my strength, it just walked through it like it didn't matter." She frowned. "You know, I've encountered a lot of bad things in my life. Fought some of them, too. Nightmare Moon, she was bad, but it was more she was just so angry. At the core of that anger was hurt and loneliness. She had reasons for being what she was. Discord, he was evil, but he seemed to have a sense of fair play, for lack of a better word. He didn't kill any pony, or anything like that. Maybe it was just that he didn't have time, but... Marshall let her follow her train of thought, just rubbing her neck calmly. She closed her eyes. Queen Chrysalis was the closest thing to real, palpable malice that I've ever encountered. Even that was a kind of selfishness, really. She didn't care who she hurt to meet her goals. She was evil, but she was also looking out for her subjects. They feed on love, you see. She paused for a moment, then spoke in a small voice. That thing, there was no reasoning with it. I don't think it has enough of a capacity for reason to reason with. It was just... She found herself without words. She was startled slightly when Marshall pitched his voice in a slightly absurd accent and spoke instead. A man like Ringo has got a great big hole right in the middle of him. He can never kill enough or steal enough or inflict enough pain to ever fill it. He pitched his voice slightly differently, as though he was continuing dialogue. What does he need? Then back to the other voice. Revenge. He was quiet then, and she frowned, sensing there was more. She rolled her face slightly to look up at him. Revenge for what, Marshall? He grinned and continued in that original accent. Being born. She shivered. Scary. That's a quote from something, isn't it? He sighed. Yep. Movie called Tombstone. It seemed appropriate. She nodded into his leg. I think you're right, Marshall. I don't know about the more preternatural aspects of the thing, Twy. All I felt was pants-shitting terror from being chased by it. Still, I've seen you react to stuff I can't sense before, so... He shook his head. She sighed. Take my word for it, Marshall. That was the closest thing I've ever felt to unadulterated evil. Just seething off of it. And the worst part is, I think it was made to be that way. How is that possible? Why would some pony do it? He sighed. I'm of the opinion that something has to be sapient before it can be really evil. But that doesn't mean you can't turn an animal bad, Sparks. Abuse a dog enough, train it a certain way, and you turn it into a killing machine. It doesn't want to be bad, you understand? It just can't know any other way. She frowned. Do you think it was put here intentionally? Like, something is actively trying to stop us? If it is, stop us from what? Marshall groaned and cracked his neck with a quick jerk of his head, making a noise that always bothered her, just a little. It's a little too specialized not to make assumptions to that effect. I think you've got the wrong idea. They, whoever they are, aren't trying to stop me. I mean, it hunts magic, Twy. How many magic-using ponies have you seen on this island? She shivered again. He considered his position for a moment, then frowned. Still, I suppose there's really no telling for sure. That thing gave every impression of having been there a while. And I chose which spot on the barrier to examine. She nodded. We can't afford to make assumptions, Marshall. We have to approach this whole situation systematically, logically, and with as little bias as possible. It's our only hope. They were silent for a while, then she rolled onto her back and looked him in the face, the back of her head resting on his thigh. In this position her hooves just sort of naturally folded against her barrel, like a begging dog or praying mantis. He raised an eyebrow at her. Who saved who when is a completely academic question, Marshall. The fact of the matter is, you saved my life, and I'm grateful. He gave her a ghost of a smile. You're welcome, Spark. I sense a butt in there somewhere. She gave him a meaningful look and didn't say anything, just stared at him with those liquid amethyst eyes filled with compassion and understanding. He stared down, his face twisting in indecision, then he looked away, his expression distant. He started to say something, but he beat her to it. Later is now, huh? He sighed. He looked out at the clearing and at the slowly untensing root scraper herd. The thing was out of sight again, but it had relented temporarily before. They weren't going anywhere any time soon. She flicked her uninjured ear at him in a go-on sort of gesture. He slipped loose from her and stepped away, his back to her. His posture became stiff, and he folded his arms behind his back. "There's really not much to tell, Twilight, but if you want the story..." She frowned and folded her legs under her in the standard pony position of recline, the intimacy of the moment completely gone. She bit her lip. "If you don't want to..." He sighed. It was a routine landing. Then this fucking island happened. There was no warning, no sign that anything was wrong. Just 1 second the FOB approach lights were there, and the next they weren't. And the GPS, the Global Positioning Satellite Locator, lost signal. That was the only indication that I had at the time that something was wrong. We hit the treetops that weren't supposed to be there and lost 2 engines before I really knew what the fuck was going on. I did everything I could to prevent the crash. And when I realized that there was no chance of that, I did everything I could to survive the crash with everyone intact. He turned back, and his expression was odd. It was obvious that these were painful memories for him, but there was something else, an evasiveness that she didn't like, because it was so uncharacteristic of him. It wasn't enough. I survived. The rest of my crew didn't. They didn't all die at once, but they did die. The fucked up part, Twilight, is that if I had managed to pull out of that crash, we all would have died when I hit the barrier. He looked out sullenly at the jungle canopy, and Twilight felt a moment's regret for forcing this on him. Her curiosity was hardly sated, however. There was more to this story, at least for him, than he was telling her. She could feel it, like a scab that was half loose, but still slightly adhered to an old wound. He sighed and shook his head. Sometimes the universe gives you a binary solution set. You always have a choice, but sometimes the choice is choosing between 2 equally unacceptable outcomes. I made mistakes, Twilight. Mistakes in judgment, mistakes in procedure. And while I probably couldn't have saved them, that doesn't make me any less responsible for their deaths. She shook her head. How are you culpable, Marshall? Didn't they have choices? Are you somehow saying that you caused your plane to be trapped on an alien island in a huge impenetrable bubble? He shook his head, irritated at her word choice. I didn't say I was culpable. Culpability is the assumption of blame, that I was guilty somehow of wrongdoing, which I wasn't. I was responsible. I was their superior officer, and I was their pilot. Whether I could have saved them or not is irrelevant. By accepting that position, I made myself responsible for them. If there were choices to make, I was responsible for making them. That's the definition of leadership, Twy. Being the one who's responsible for making the decisions and owning up to that responsibility. She frowned at his logic, but remained silent, considering. She knew there was more to this. Yes, he was very serious where safety was concerned, but he was also a realist. Some might even call him pessimistic. He was telling her, but by doing so, he wasn't telling her. He turned away again, shifting from one foot to the other, then stalked the edge of the circle of adult root scrapers. She sighed, her ears drooping in dismay, and lay with her chin to the ground, considering. She felt like she hadn't learned anything at all, and worse, now he was obviously upset. Calling attention to his emotional state would only upset him further. It was a hard lesson, and not one she entirely agreed with, but she couldn't see a way free of it. Sometimes the only option is silence. After an hour or so of this uncharacteristic quietude, he looked at the sky and scowled. It's gonna rain tonight. She jerked awake at this statement and frowned. What? He sighed. It's gonna rain tonight, and we have to face facts, Twy. You're gonna have to stay with the herd tonight. She nodded, then blinked and gave him a scowl. What do you mean, you? He unclipped his canteen from his belt and tossed it next to her. There's a few swallows left of that, and we have no food, no weapons, no shelter. We can't start a fire, and that thing is out there stalking you. Home is at least 15 miles away, and at night, it might as well be 100. She gave him a skeptical look. This explains the you comment. How? He gave her a neutral expression. Come on, Twilight. You said it yourself. It's after you. It doesn't care about me. I'm about as magical as a rock. Maybe it can see better at night, and maybe it can't. The point is, by myself, I can get to our packs and get back here. Then we're set. We hole up here with the herd till it gives up, then we break for home. With our supplies, we have options." Her ears flattened against her head. "I do not like this plan, Marshall. This is a bad plan. If you're wrong, your knife isn't going to stop that thing. So what if it isn't after you? What about everything else? What if there's another of those cat squid things out there?" He shook his head irritably. "Twilight, give me some credit. I've survived just fine on this island for 5 years without you. She stood up, bristling at this comment. "Marshall, this isn't an attack on your competency. Yes, you're the big bad human. We don't need those things immediately. What you're talking about is an unnecessary risk." He narrowed his eyes. "I am not leaving valuable supplies just sitting out there." She jerked her head back. "Are you listening to yourself? Who's going to grab them? Most of it isn't even edible. Whether you go out now or a week from now, the outcome is the same. Marshall, I understand you're upset. I'm sorry I made you talk about that stuff. But don't—" "Twilight, I am not debating this with you. I'm telling you what I'm going to do. The longer we wait, the longer it's going to take to find that stuff. Right now, all I have to do is follow the damn broken back trail of that thing back to where I tossed those packs. It's a risk, but it's one that I can manage." She shook her head. "What is it that's got you so—" He scowled down at her. "You can't help yourself, can you? Everything doesn't fit together nice and tidy. You can't go through life characterizing every dent and ding and expecting the world to fall neatly in line with Twilight Sparkle's expectations. I told you, Twilight, sometimes there are no good choices. Sometimes there are shitty choices, and you make the best fucking decision you can, and then you live with yourself or you fucking don't!" She stared at his verbal explosion, shocked beyond words. She had never seen him like this. It was so unexpected that she just sat there, frozen for several seconds. He stared at her, staring at him, then something in his eyes changed, and he turned away. "Fuck this," he muttered. Then he made a break for it. This time, he made it through. By the time she had recovered enough of her wits to call after him, his retreating back had already disappeared into the ever-increasing gloom. End Chapter 7. Okay, guys, I've got a little treat for you, for those of you who have been loyal and following this audio version. This chapter had a very interesting part in it, in that about halfway through it, Twilight decides to prod him about his past. And this chapter went through a considerable amount of revision, and there was an entire scene that I deleted entirely, and I'm happy with the deletion. I'm happy with removing it, okay? Because it was out of character for Marshall to be that forthcoming with his past and how he ended up on the island. And there was the other problem with it was that there was a lot of exposition in it. It was Marshall telling a story, and I tried to break that up by doing flashbacks, and the whole thing just came out kind of awkward. But that being said, there's some really good byplay in it. There's some history there, you know. So even though I deleted it from the chapter and removed it entirely, it still exists. And so I thought, as kind of a treat, like I said, for those of you who have been following this, that I would actually read it for you. And I should point out, like I said, it's very rough. It's very exposition heavy, and it's not some of my best work, but it is material that nobody but maybe a couple of pre-readers has ever heard. And it does talk a little bit about the history of Marshall and his entrance onto the island. So here you go, guys. This is the alternate scene in which Marshall confesses what happened. Okay, and it does end rather abruptly. I'll let you know when it ends. And I'm only reading this because I don't believe that it reveals any spoilers for things that are to come. So here you go. This is the deleted scene for Chapter 7. It's going to start, and you're going to recognize a little bit of it, and then you'll see the moment when it starts to go down an alternate path. He stared down, his face twisting in indecision. Then he looked away, his expression distant. She started to say something, but he beat her to it. Later is now, huh? He sighed. He looked out at the clearing, and at the still tense and wary root-scraper herd. The thing was out of sight again, but it had relented temporarily before. They weren't going anywhere, any time soon. She flicked her uninjured ear at him in a go-on sort of gesture. He took a deep breath, let it out, then started with a bit of a rush. C-130 is a beast of a plane, Twilight. It can carry up to 34,000 pounds of material, can be converted into a mid-air refueler. It can lose up to 2 engines and still come down in one piece. It's not fast, it's a hauler. Slow and steady, but it moves, Twi. It moves hardware. Been a workhorse since the 1950s. She watched him calmly, his face distant, as he worked up the nerve. She knew he was dancing around the subject, giving her a lecture that wasn't really pertinent to the discussion, but he was trying. He was trying. The thing is, a C-130 isn't a small aircraft. Typical crew complement is... He paused again. 5. Some new kid, an airman just out of aircrew school. First flight. Mostly in charge of making sure everything is balanced and met weight requirements. Safety stuff. They called them loadmasters. Petty officers Michael Grapes Welchel and Ike Looney Tunes Carmichael, flight engineer and flight medical officer. He used to call them Mike and Ike. Man, they hated that. He looked down. Pilot, that was me. Co-pilot, that was Sassy. Lieutenant Janine Jaworski. He chuckled. The Navy Pilots Association chooses your call sign, you know. Originally I was Beetle, 'cause my last name was Bailey. And there was this comic strip about a character named Beetle Bailey. Not very imaginative, I know. He frowned. Later it got changed to Rain Man. Enough said about that. Anyway, Sassy was short for Sasquatch. He chuckled. Because one day, one of the other female pilots saw her shaving her legs in the officer's head, and supposedly it was quite a traumatizing sight. Twilight was suddenly struck with the almost irresistible urge to ask why in Celestia's name human females would shave their legs, but resisted with Herculean effort. He sighed. We were way over our recommended flight hours, but when the push is on, you just grab the gear and move, you know. Air crew loaded us up, 6 pallets, full load, with barely enough time to catch a catnap. Kept hoping the turnaround or pre-flight inspection would catch some gripe, you know, something just give us a few hours, but no dice. So we loaded on, Mike and Ike and the kid strapped in, and by the time we'd been in the air for 10 minutes, all 3 of them were just passed the fuck out. He grinned sadly. Not that I blamed him, the bastards. She smiled slightly at this. So we're in flight for 5 hours, Sassy and I working in shifts. Worked out the poundage necessary for reaching the FOB. Caught a good tailwind that was pushing us a little ahead of schedule and gave us a nice little 1,300-pound fuel surplus. Everything's golden. We're descending to 10,000 feet, warming up the Nemesis DIRCM system. It checks green. We're going through the checklist. Her ears perked up a bit and he grinned. Thought you'd like that. She clopped a hoof on his knee and made continue motions with her other hoof. His expression turned distant again. Anyway, the whole flight there, one of the buckles on Sassy's flight bags is just rattling against the deck plate. Nothing steady, like tap, 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 tap. This thing is driving me nuts the whole way there. I'm tired and we're landing, and that's never fun because you never know when some insurgent asshole's going to take a pot shot at you. And I mean, it hadn't happened for months, but that doesn't mean tonight couldn't be your lucky night. I'm tired and I've had enough, so I turn to Sassy and say, Sass, secure that goddamn rattle bag, will you? Fucking thing is driving me nuts. Janine Sassy Jaworski grinned, her twinkling eyes hidden behind her aviators, and reached to unbuckle her flight harness. Come on, Cappy. You can't wait 10 goddamn minutes? He did a final check of instrumentation, then gave her a sidelong look as she fumbled for the errant flight bag. I can, but I don't have to. That's what subordinates are for. Besides, that's FOD, foreign object debris. You hoe bag. Oh, someone's wearing the bossy pants today. She grabbed the bag and stuffed the offending buckle more securely against the bag itself. I swear, they need to start letting you take your grandpa naps, Rain Man. You get fucking pissy when... The entire aircraft shuddered suddenly in an unexpected welter of hard turbulence. Marshall glanced up, did a double take, then scowled. God damn it. The fucking ALS is out. I just had it. Sassy looked out the canopy, but there really wasn't much to see without the twinkling approach lights of the FOB. Ah, damn it. Nothing works right in these shitholes, she muttered. Can it, Sassy? Marshall muttered. He hit the hot mic button on his flight stick. FOB 12 Foxtrot Niner, this is Nomad 166480. Request immediate ground crew assistance, over. Marshall frowned when nothing but static met his call. FOB 12 Foxtrot Niner, wake up in there and give me some goddamn ground assistance. Your porch lights are out. Repeat, your lights are out, over. Sassy and Marshall shared an uneasy glance at the silence. Then Marshall clicked the selector, and then the hot mic again. Pilot to air crew, radio check, over. Station 1, check, over. Station 2, what's the dealio, Captain, over. Station 3, checking in, over. The two pilots gave one another a confused look, since both had been pretty positive their radio had somehow gone out. Marshall gave the altimeter a glance, realized that they'd come to about 1,500 feet or so, and made a snap decision. Sassy, hit the high beam. Something screwy's going on. We might have to touch and go, but we're flying too heavy for any shenanigans. Sassy clicked the high beam, which gave them a powerful spotlight on the underside of the plane. Marshall began to pan it downward from the stow position and caught sight of something flickering in the lower edge of the light, just in the pitch blackness. What the... His eyes widened and he attempted to pull up, going to full wartime throttle. The 4 turboprop engines howled at the increased strain. Then another deeper sound rumbled through the hull, and a whistling whine culminating in a massive bang shuddered through the entire aircraft. Sassy jolted almost out of her seat, grabbing her stick to assist in the maneuver, too late realizing treetops, those were treetops, that something was wrong with the landscape beneath them. The number 4 engine, the right wing outmost engine, had ground its way into the treetops, and the roaring full-throttle Allison T56A16 turboprop engine had drunk deep of the vegetation around it and coughed out its guts in a cataclysmic cloud of torn metal and flames. The sudden shift in flight characteristics and the torturous drag of slamming through yards of foliage dropped the wing even further, and with a torturous scream the number 3 ate death as well. Sassy's pupils went to pinpricks as she watched the prop vanish in a spray of fire. Seconds later, the entire aircraft shuddered as something massive struck the hull just behind the right wing. The air pressure suddenly changed with a sickening pop, and then they were clear of the jungle and over a white expanse of sand? What? Marshall screamed in terror, fighting the bucking cargo plane as it dipped towards the dunes of what could not possibly be the Afghanistan desert, not where they had been headed. He had literally seconds to react. If he couldn't get her nose up, they were going to turn this bird into a lawn dart. Nose up, you dirty bitch, he growled, heaving at the controls. At the last second, assisted by the weight balanced in her cargo space, the C-130 drunkenly nosed up just as she slammed into and then through a dune. The world turned into a confusing kaleidoscope of freakish still images, sounds, and sensations. A sensation of pain in Marshall's cheek, and something external grated against his teeth for a moment. The pressure of the harness as the aircraft tilted and slewed, tortured metal tearing. Sassy's tortured shriek cut off and the sound of dry sticks fracturing as she was tossed around the small pilot's compartment. The furious whine of the still operational left-wing engines. Somehow, through all of this madness, he had the presence of mind to emergency stop the throttle, causing the turboprop engines to gutter out and die. Then came one last horrendous impact, and everything faded into a soupy maroon haze. I don't know how long I was out, Marshall said quietly. Couldn't have been long, but it was just starting to get daylight when I came to. The plane was at a weird listing angle, which I figured came from the right wing dipping into that first dune we hit and dragging the plane into a kind of clockwise spin. Most of the right wing snapped off, but it
dug in deep enough to lift the left side upwards at an angle. How the whole damn thing didn't come apart, I guess I'll leave up to good engineering or manufacturing. Most of the load stayed put, but enough of it shifted around in the cargo hold that it was a mess in there. Twilight watched the interplay of emotions drift across his face, fascinated. It was like he was seeing all that devastation in his mind's eye, and she was seeing it through him. Marshall jerked awake with a sickening lurch and a wet cough, then leaned forward and spat out a wad of gore. His face was a mass of pain, and a quick exploration with his fingers revealed that he had a new, albeit temporary, orifice. He groaned and weakly pawed at his harness, the buckles resisting his half-dazed efforts to free himself. The canopy in front of him was shattered, letting in the hot, chemical scent of hot metal, spilled JP-8, fried electronics, and dead, dry sand. He blinked, winced, then finally unbuckled his harness. Next he removed his flight helmet and let it fall to the deck. He lurched to his feet, then slipped on the skewed deck and caught himself by grabbing the ceiling with one gloved hand. "Sassy?" The word came out mangled, his mutilated cheek letting the air out oddly. A dull, aching throb set up in residence in his skull. There was no answer. Stumbling down the 30-degree incline towards the rear of the aircraft, he noted that the frame in which the hatch separating the cargo compartment and flight compartment had been badly bent, causing the hatch to pop open and bow crazily outward. A coppery, iron sort of smell mixed with the other, less pleasant scents reached his nostrils, and he stopped and stared, transfixed. Something had struck the side of the cargo compartment, ripping a hole the size of a small compact car in the side of the aircraft. Whatever it was had bounced around inside like a crazy top, and what it had done to the crewmen inside. He leaned over almost casually and was noisily sick on the deck. The scrambled pile of offal flung up against the jumbled military-style crates and hard cases was so intermixed that it was nearly impossible to tell how many victims were involved. Crazily, it looked as though there were too many limbs. Mixed in with the bloody mess were bits and pieces of metal torn and twisted unrecognizably, along with what looked like part of one of the huge props the C-130 used for propulsion. Marshall turned away from the scene of horror and slid down with his back to the bent and bowed metal frame, staring blindly out the shattered canopy to the morning outside. He jerked suddenly, eyes widening, when he cast his gaze on a crumpled form tossed seemingly casually against the back of the co-pilot's flight station. He jerked to his feet and stumbled in that direction. "Sassy?" There was no answer. He dropped to his knees next to her, fearing the worst. Her left arm was badly broken, a jagged piece of bone tenting but not quite breaking the skin in her forearm. Similarly, her legs were badly broken, but she had no compound fractures there. What really frightened him, terrified him actually, was the angle of her back. She looked like a G.I. Joe that a child had stepped on, leaving everything below the waist at a just subtly not right angle. He tentatively felt her neck for a pulse and found one, weak but steady. He let out a sigh of relief. Then he located the emergency medical kit, no easy task in the nightmare jumble of the crash, and set to work. She was out for most of the day. You have to understand that my priorities at the time were first aid and short-term survival. I don't know what the hell was going on, but I couldn't even have begun to guess how fucked we were. She nodded quietly, sorry for the pain she was putting him through, but realizing that at this point he had to talk about it. It was like a flood of poisonous blood and pus from an infected wound, from something that had lain there eating away at the core of him. She put a hoof gently on his hand, and without realizing that he was doing it, he grasped it absently. The wreck was covered in JP-8. The C-130 keeps its fuel bladders in the wings, and it was getting hotter and hotter, and the stink, God, the stink. He winced. One of the first things they teach you in first aid is never move someone you suspect has a neck or back injury. But then they don't expect you'll be treating someone in the equivalent of a convection oven covered in jet fuel. I tried to be as careful as I could, but... There was nothing human in that sound. It was a human voice stripped of sentience, a throat-tearing sound of mortal agony. Marshall hardened himself against it and finished moving his stricken comrade onto the wire-frame emergency stretcher that all C-130s carried standard. He had performed as much first aid as he was capable of, set her arm and legs, but the wreck was heating up quickly now from the boiling sun outside, and the stink was getting to the point where it caused his eyes to water. Not to mention, with all the JP-8 soaked into the dirt. Granted, the flash point was ridiculously high, but that wouldn't be much consolation if it actually did go up. He finished strapping the now weakly cursing Sassy into the stretcher and stood up, wiping sweat from his brow. He shook his head and grit his teeth. The flesh under the makeshift bandage on his cheek burned as the muscles of his face stretched, but he relished the pain. It kept him focused. He had hoped that Sassy would remain unconscious for the entire operation, but halfway through moving her carefully onto the stretcher, she'd woken screaming. For a while he'd been afraid she wouldn't stop, but one of their precious applications of painkiller had quieted that down, at least until he had to strap her in. He bent down next to her side and fixed a calm expression onto his face. He probably failed a bit, but, well, he was trying, damn it. "Hey, Sass. Sorry about that, but..." He gestured around them. She got her breathing under control and opened her eyes, staring into his face. "What the fuck happened, Marsh?" He sighed. "Near as I can tell, what the GPS, INS, and common sense told us was the FOB was in fact a jungle right next to a desert. We clipped the treetops and foughted the hell out of 3 and 4 and crashed onto the edge of the desert." She stared at him for a moment, and then her eyes flicked away, swiveling around the cabin. "What about..." He put a hand on her arm. "Dead. All dead. That bang and the loss of cabin pressure was the number 3 prop slamming into the side of the plane, I think. It's not pretty in there." She closed her eyes and took a deep breath. "Jesus H. fucking Christ." He frowned. "Sass, how do you feel?" She opened her eyes and gave him an "are you fucking kidding me" sort of look. "How do I feel? Marshall, my everything hurts." She frowned, and after a moment visibly paled and shook her head. "Except my legs. Marsh, I can't feel my fucking legs." He took her right hand, her good hand, and she squeezed it hard. "Hey, I know, okay? You're scared, I'm scared. But look, the ELT is operational, and it has a battery life of like 4 years. You're going to find us. It's just a matter of time. They fly you to a modern hospital and..." She winced. "And what, Marshall?" He squeezed her hand and let go. "You can't give up hope. I'm going to get you through this, Janine. All you have to do is sit back and keep your strength up." She nodded and let out a shaky breath and winced. "I don't suppose we have any more painkillers?" He nodded and gave her another, mindful of the dosage. Sure, it was eating into their dwindling supplies, but keeping her comfortable and keeping her strength up took absolute top priority. Besides, SAR was going to find them in a few hours. A day or two, tops. Right? That's actually where I stopped. Again, that's very rough. I never actually continued it any further than that because at that point I realized that I was making a mistake. That Marshall was a little more guarded about everything that had happened, and at that stage in the story, he wasn't willing to open up to Twilight. And subsequent to that, she knows better than to poke or pry at his past because he's very sensitive about it. There are probably some inaccuracies in the flight scenes and how aircraft actually work. I didn't really research it that well, and normally I will research things really well, but again, this was a rough draft, and I never actually ended up including the scene. The events which occurred in the crash may have changed since then. I have to check my notes. But that's just a possibility. It was something I started to write in which Marshall was kind of revealing what had happened to him, and then I eventually scrapped because, like I said, it didn't make sense for the character. Like, it was not true to Marshall's characterization, and I finally stopped. But it's still there, so there you have it. Anyway, this is carried on a little bit longer than I probably would like, so I will leave it at there. I hope you enjoyed this and the little extra at the end of it. And in the meantime, stay safe, and I will talk at you later.